right over your head one way or another. But
Yeah, that's what happens when I use the laptop camera because it
hmm,
gets fingerprinty.
yeah. Oh well. So let's see. I think we should be live. I'm just waiting for the preview to go up on my page. I think we're broadcasting. And there we go. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis,
And I'm Mike Mateen.
and tonight we are discussing slash celebrating the career of Sam Raimi, specifically as expressed through three of his films: Evil Dead 2, A Simple Plan, and Spider-Man 2. That's in chronological order. Although just our difficulty scheduling this episode allowed me my obsessive time to watch through all of his movies again, including a couple that I had not seen before. So maybe I will touch on each of those briefly as we go chronologically through his movies. I don't know. What do you think? I mean,
Yeah,
if you've seen them, we can discuss each briefly. But
I've
well,
seen a majority of them, I think, and I watched one extra movie as well.
hmm?
I watched A Simple Plan.
Well, Simple Plan was the one of the three, right?
Why did I? Yeah, I don't remember why I just said that.
That's okay.
I
I know.
what did I watch extra then?
Quick and the Dead, maybe.
Yes, yeah. Sorry,
No,
just
no,
kind of
no
blending.
worries. That was certainly one of the ones that we talked about maybe doing last time because it's good.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, so Sam Raimi, of course, he's in the public eye more recently because he has directed the most recent of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. I know you're not like an MCU guy; you haven't really seen those, but I liked it, and so that had me thinking about Sam Raimi, and so Sam Raimi seemed like a good guy to talk about. But he has been making movies for a long time, and so in the process of going back to watch his whole catalog, I didn't go back and watch like his short films or music videos and that sort of thing, but I did start with The Evil Dead all the way back in 1981. And we're going to talk more about Evil Dead 2, but The Evil Dead, this first one, when we talked about this at the end of the last episode, I think what I kind of said about it is that, it's more interesting for its potential than anything else. It's more of a straight horror film than kind of a comedy hybrid like Evil Dead 2 is. But you know what? I rewatched it and that movie's amazing. It's really good. It is kind of some of those same things that I said. It does not have that same sort of level of comedy to it that Evil Dead 2 does. It's more of a straight up horror movie, but it's actually really good. It's a micro budget, but it's kind of amazing what he manages to do on that micro budget. I think anyone who's interested in Sam Raimi and can tolerate horror movies at all should watch it. It's worth it, I think.
I've definitely seen it. I did not rewatch it as part
Hmm.
of this.
Yeah. I found that I enjoyed it. Like I thought of it as a movie that I liked, but I enjoyed it more than I even remembered when I went back for it. But then the next movie that he did, leapfrogging from the indie success of The Evil Dead, he gets a bigger budget to make his next movie, which is not Evil Dead 2, but a movie called Crime Wave that almost nobody has heard of because everyone has kind of disavowed themselves of it in many respects. And I had not seen it and decided to watch it this time. You can find it. I think it's just on Prime Video. And that movie is strange, man. It's a little bit like taking the tone of the wackiest sections from Evil Dead 2 and then extending that to a whole movie that's ostensibly set in the real world, kind of a crime story. But that tone, the sort of tone where people talk in silly voices and have cartoon sound effects accompany their exaggerated gestures, it's very strange. And I went back and forth while watching it constantly between a feeling of like, oh yeah, this is just kind of incoherent and a mess, and like I don't know, and then there will be a sequence where it's like, oh my gosh, this rules. Is this movie great actually? Oh wait, no, no, actually not so much. And it's just constantly back and forth because it has these moments of just inspired genius, but then it's just those are struggling to stay afloat in a soup of nonsense. I feel like once again, if you're interested in really like digging deep into Sam Raimi's stuff, it's sort of fascinating from that perspective, but it's not, you know, good really. Um, it's weird, is what it is. But then after that totally fails, um, Sam Raimi says, "Well, okay, what if I do Evil Dead again?" And apparently Army of Darkness, you know, like him going back in time was originally what he wanted to do for the follow-up, but he got persuaded at the time. It's like, okay, listen, you expanded your scope quite a bit for Crime Wave and it didn't go great. Let's try resetting back to your just a cabin again and see what you can do there. And turns out he did great because Evil Dead 2 is amazing. It's a film unlike any other. And it's why we decided that would be the first one to talk about.
It is unlike any other film. That is
Mm-hmm.
true.
Yeah. What's your history with Evil Dead, or you know, Evil Dead 2 and or the Evil Dead, or any of those? Like, what is your like? How did you first become aware of them?
I mean, I first became aware of them because of Army of Darkness.
Mm,
That was the first one that I remember like seeing that it was in the theater. I probably watched it on cable, but didn't really understand what was happening. And I definitely took just kind of shelved it at that point. I don't know what got me to want to go back. It was probably just again this conversation with either you or other friends that are kind of into the more of the cult movie type stuff.
mm,
And it was and I probably had watched it on like late night cable at some point, probably all edited up and didn't really understand what was happening then in that movie, this
yeah.
movie either. So it's just kind of always been around and something I'm aware of. And then I dove into it again. I don't know how, I mean, maybe this was 20 years ago.
Mm,
Um, I decided to like actually give it a shot and get it and commit to it and watch it. And so I watched Evil Dead 2, realized that I probably wanted to watch the actual original Evil Dead. Like I knew enough to know that you didn't have to watch it to watch Evil Dead 2. Like it's
mm-hmm.
not like this is really exactly a sequel to it.
Well, yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah.
It's yeah, it has an odd like this movie and the original Evil Dead have a, like sit together in an odd way
Mm-hmm.
as movies sit together. Um, and then rewatched Army of Darkness, and since then it's just been something that hey, every once in a while, let's dial this up, or
Mm-hmm.
if I see it on, let's just watch it. I mean, it's like less than an hour. I felt like it's like less than an hour and a half.
It's right at about an hour and a half. A lot of Sam Raimi's early movies are all riding that line. It's an hour and 24 minutes. Evil Dead 2.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's super quick watch. Really, I mean, it's like high intensity interval training, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's just like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, 20 seconds on, 10 seconds, it's just, and
Mm-hmm.
you kind of get a lot of bang for your buck in an hour and 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I love it, but it is, I've definitely realized, at least for me, it's a movie you've got to be in the mood for. Like, you got to be ready to watch this.
Yeah.
It's not something you're just like sitting around, and it's not like Shawshank or something like that, right? Where it's like, oh, I'll just plug in anywhere and
It
I could spend an hour on it, right?
yeah,
Like,
it kind of demands your attention, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, whereas it feels like something like Shawshank, even if you love it, it's a movie that's easy to have on in the background. And then you
right.
occasionally look over it at it. But you feel like this one, if you tried to do anything else, like Skeleton Hands would reach out of the screen and grab you by the lapels and make you watch it. You know, look back at the screen.
That, I mean, that's kind of why I described it as as like interval, like high intensity intervals, right? Like it's because
Mm-hmm.
it's not like going for a long leisurely run, right? Like maybe Shawshank would be. I know I picked that because that's they're very different in their watching, right?
Sure.
Like Shawshank is just a movie where you don't have to be in the mood for it. It just shows up. You can watch a
Yeah.
piece of it. You can watch all of it. You can do something else, like you said. But this movie, you got to like decide, commit, and not let not look away because it's going to keep coming at you, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
exactly
Mm-hmm.
what you just said. So it's, I mean, it's a lot of fun, but
Yeah, my history with it, I think, is pretty similar to yours because Army of Darkness comes out in 1992, and we'll talk a little bit about it. So that was 5 years later. This one comes out in 1987. Both of us probably too young for it when I was in the theater, right? Like, not to say it couldn't have happened, but Army of Darkness, on the other hand, that comes out 92. That we're 14, where it's like it's rated R, but that's maybe like in the years where maybe a couple of years after that, maybe you find it on video, that sort of thing. But then hearing about Evil Dead 2 is a prequel to it. Is that what's going on there? And actually, hang on, I want to double check what year High Fidelity was. High Fidelity came out in the year 2000, which seems crazy to me. It seems like I would have guessed almost 10 years before that, but I guess not. The reason I think of it is just because in High Fidelity, the Jack Black character, who is like the super obsessive intense nerd, when John Cusack is wanting to try to illustrate a point or with a metaphor, he talks about it's like, what do you think it would mean if someone told you that they hadn't seen Evil Dead 2 yet? And that was like the example that they gave to his character about it. And so, but in any case, let's talk about the movie itself, though, where the Evil Dead, the first one, is like the quintessential archetype. Like, it wasn't at the time, but became this like almost a cliche of a bunch of teenagers go to this remote cabin in the woods and all get killed by something, right? Like that's what it is, right? And I mean, they made a movie called The Cabin in the Woods, and it's not unclear what that's originally drawing from, right? But but in the original, we have Ash, who comes up with his girlfriend, his sister, his friend, his male friend, and a girl that his friend has picked up. And Ash is the only survivor by the end. But then here's Evil Dead 2. They're coming along making it, except they don't actually have the rights to use the footage from the first one, and they want it to be a sequel, like that continues the story. So they decide, in a bizarre decision, but that's what they went with, to semi recreate some of the scenes from the first one to sort of do a like previously on the Evil Dead in fast forward, except not quite the same because they want to do it all in 10 minutes so that they can get to the new stuff. And so you have slightly different versions of everything where it's just Ash and his girlfriend coming up by themselves, and then dealing with her turning evil and like all of that stuff. But, so the beginning of Evil Dead 2 is this sort of retake. Like it is, this is what happened before, only a little different. Don't worry about it. But I feel like that's why because it's not the same and it's not using the footage and there are details that are different. That's why I think sometimes it can get confusing as like, well, is it supposed to be like a remake or what? But like that's the answer, is that it's just like, okay, let's just do it. And then it's funny because we'll talk about this with Army of Darkness, but Army of Darkness kind of does that again, almost like it's a joke. Like it's trying to recap what happened to get Ash sent back in time, but it likewise it shoots that stuff again. It doesn't it again doesn't use old clips.
right.
But
That one was more as like satirical because
Yeah.
of the way the first one came out. Yeah.
Right. And so, like, the progression of the trilogy is certainly more and more comedic as we go, right? Less and less about the horror elements. Because Evil Dead 2 is like this perfect hybrid because it is still a horror movie where people are getting killed horribly and there's like geysers of blood and stuff like that. But it's also got this incredible tone where Ash from the first movie is still just this kind of, baby-faced teenager going through horrible experiences and doing the best he can, but only by the end is he even really trying to fight back, and it's still horrific and terrible and not going well, and he barely pulls through. And now in Evil Dead 2, he basically loses his mind entirely and has to completely dissociate from any sort of normal human emotion to the point where he becomes an unstoppable badass who has no actual connection to reality anymore.
It's
Yeah.
it's an odd, yes, transition. You really, so I said you got to be ready for this film because otherwise, like, it's not just even like it's not even like you said, like with things happening so fast and like skeleton hands will come out of nowhere. But his character in this movie, like to root for him, it takes a certain mindset because it is like you said, he's so disassociated
Well,
with
right.
like
It's kind of
reality.
there's
But you
definite.
like,
Yeah,
yeah,
you root for him kind of like a little bit by default. Like you're not going to root for the Deadites. I mean, they're monsters. But also, like, it's really just sort. Well, the thing is too, in it's Army of Darkness where he just full on becomes a cocky asshole, right?
right.
Like in this one, when he's acting like that, it's pretty justified in a lot of respects. Like, so the plot of this one is we have sort of the fast forward version of him and Linda, his girlfriend, coming up, her turning evil, him having to kill her. And then we have most of the movie, like, is him being tormented by these evil creatures in this cabin. His hands turns evil. He has to cut it off, and then he's having to fight his evil disembodied hand, and all these crazy things are happening. But in the meantime, we're occasionally cross-cutting with the daughter of the archaeologist who originally found the Book of the Dead that released all of these demons, who is coming up to meet with him, not knowing that everything has gone wrong, having a hard time getting up there, and then she ends up showing up, reinfusing the movie with some fresh blood, literally. Um, her nothing character boyfriend, Ed, the local towny tow truck driver guy who gets them up the trail, and then the tow truck driver's girlfriend, right? They all show up. And it's kind of hilarious because although we know what's been going on with Ash, from the perspective of everyone just showing up, they show up and find this one guy who's not supposed to be there, covered with blood, blood everywhere, chainsaws, and it's a fairly reasonable conclusion for them to assume that he's the one that's a monster. And yet, it's also, given that we know what he's been through, his reaction when he finally gets out of the bind they put him in, being pretty irritated with them. It's like, yeah, he's being sort of a cocky asshole, but to some extent we get it. Like, it's not unreasonable for him to feel that way. Like, we get why they wouldn't believe him, but also but there's just so much going on in this movie, and so much use of the fact that a lot of horror and a lot of humor actually do have kind of similar construction in a lot of ways. You build tension and then you release tension. And, it's making use of all of that. Like, one of the best gags in the whole movie, I think, is this whole bit where later in the movie, uh, Jake, the tow truck driver, had run off trying to save his girlfriend and failing. But he's gone as far as we know. We have the daughter who's got this ancient dagger, and she's worried, someone's coming after her, because this is when Ash is temporarily turned evil. And so we hear the door getting, pounded open, and then she prepares the dagger, but it's not him, it's Jake, and she accidentally stabs him in the stomach because she doesn't realize. And then there's this whole bit of like, oh no, he's fallen limp in the doorway, so she can't get the door closed because he's there, and he's pissed at her for stabbing him. And there's this whole sequence where she's trying to get him out of the door, and he's cursing her out for stabbing him, and he's eventually like, no, drag me somewhere safe, and she drags him into the other room and then lays him down right next to the trap door where the monster can reach up through the trap door and pull him in. And then the whole punchline of the whole thing is her trying to hold on to his legs so that he doesn't get pulled in completely, just getting cut with this ridiculous geyser of blood coming out. And you sort of feel like, you probably let go at some point right there. But no, she ends up just holding the legs. And it's like, it's the sort of thing where if you're not on the wavelength of this movie, it doesn't necessarily sound funny, but in the context of the movie, it's all treated with this sort of same level of cartoon, where it is scary, but it is also funny. And it's just an amazing balance that it's hard to think of any other movie really like it.
Yeah, there's nothing like this movie. So
there's so many other just little bits, like another good gag from pretty early on. It's in this early section where we're recapping previous stuff, where he has got the head, so his evil possessed dead girlfriend, he's got the head, and he's trying to dismember her so that she'll stop coming back to life. And so he gets the head in the vise in the work shed, and then he looks up for the chainsaw, and we can see the chalk outline for where the chainsaw should go on the pegboard, but the chainsaw's not there. It's like, just in time for the body of the headless girlfriend holding the chainsaw to burst in through the door. And it's just, the construction and the pacing and the timing of all of that is just amazing. So
yeah, I mean all the pacing and the timing, I think, is we've talked about it a number of times, but it is so key to this movie. Like, it's that, and then it's not like they're overacting, but they like kind of are. Like, it's like the whole the way that like everybody like really hams it up.
oh,
right,
for sure. Yeah.
is part of this too, and I think that's where Bruce Campbell like became sort of this like cult icon, because like when he's over expressing, like he has like over expressive features, like really thick eyebrows and a really square jaw. Like it's
Well,
almost comic book, right?
I once heard him described as comedically handsome, which I think is absolutely right. He looks like a cartoon character of a really handsome guy.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he is handsome, but again, it's like almost too handsome, to the point where it kind of almost comes around again to being uncanny a little bit. And then I think in some respects, like, this is not to badmouth the other actors in this movie, but at the same time, Bruce is the star of the show for sure, and everyone else's role almost just exists for him to play off of, really, right?
Yeah.
I think that it's so clear that in this movie, that the dynamic that the two of them have really talked about in a lot over the years is that Bruce is this just really charismatic, ready for anything, let's do it sort of guy, and Sam Raimi likes to torture him. Because like so much of the movie is just like, what else can we get away with making Bruce Campbell do on camera?
It's true.
Yeah. So I don't know. What do you have other like favorite bits, or what do you think? Like, what else is
I
there
mean,
to
we've kind
say
of talked
about
about. I
this?
mean, the fact that he like modifies himself, right, and like
Mm-hmm.
puts it, gets a chainsaw in there, and he becomes like this again, like comedically, like a dude with a chainsaw hand and a shotgun. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's
Well,
just
he rigs up a little metal thing on his shoulder so that he can do the engine pull of the chainsaw one handed, and the whole montage of making all the modifications, and then of course finishing with groovy. It's like it's hard to imagine any other actor or any other director being able to make that moment work. Like, who else would even try?
yeah.
It's a,
Um, yeah, it's I mean, just that whole part is so it's like you said, it's like you have to be on the wavelength of the movie for that to be humorous because it's
mhm,
just so bizarre. And and it's I love watching this one and thinking about Army of Darkness because in Army of Darkness, like it's just like assume that's what he's like, right?
mhm,
And it's all very much like this movie ends in a weird way too, right? Because like he ends up in the Middle Ages thing and he shoots the Deadite and they all cheer him as a hero and he's like in anguish about it, right? Like
well, yeah, I mean, because I
he's like,
think,
well, now I got to save these guys from this stuff, right?
well,
Yeah,
I think, like the running thread through all of these movies, and in fact the TV show Ash versus Evil Dead, which is great. If anyone hasn't watched it, you should. It's actually really good. Like, if you like these movies, it's good in the same ways that the movies are. You should check it out. But the running thread there is Ash is just screwed. Like, the Deadites don't have real rules here. There's not a magic spell that you can do that actually just fixes everything. Ash was present when the book was read. That means they're even over the tape recorder. That means he is forever doomed, and the only reason he's still alive, honestly, is because A, kind of badass, but also the Deadites kind of like messing with him. And so like he's never going to get away from it. There's no winning for him, right? It's just like, okay, well, let's see how many rounds of Pac-Man you can you can get through before game over.
right. And that's what really like Army of Darkness like really starts off with, and
Mm-hmm.
it's fun to watch this where he's like again, like you said, he's like disassociated with it. He's kind of like, this is what I have to do. I've got to get this
Mm-hmm.
chainsaw because I've got to figure out what to do. I've got no hand, right? Like, so I
Yeah.
might as well put the chainsaw here. I've got the shotgun. Well, now I'm going to saw it off, right? So it can
Mm-hmm.
become even more powerful. But then you go into, and then he, again, you said he finishes here and he's like, God, I'm just screwed. But then when you get into Army of Darkness, it's like, well, this is who I am. I'm a shotgun toting chainsaw hand guy who
Mm-hmm.
kills deadites, right?
Yeah.
And that's where the tone shifts, right? And it's
Right.
like more
I
humorous.
I
Yeah,
think it his attitude kind of finally breaks along with his sort of standard sanity, along with just this moment where I think it finally clicks for him. No, this is just my life now. That this is not the horrible thing that I'm going to get through and then be okay. No, this is what I do now. And it is only once he kind of is comes like gets to that point that he simultaneously is able to be a little bit more at peace, but also fundamentally unable to process normal human empathy anymore. Uh, but at the same time, he's just iconic and hilarious and funny. So like Army of Darkness is not the next Sam Raimi movie, but we're kind of touching on it here anyway, so might as well. So like that's the one where like there's horror elements, but they're almost a lot more kind of soft sell. What I will say, having rewatched it this time, is that the great parts are still great, and most of them are in the first half of the movie, and then it's kind of just a big battle, and the battle has some okay bits but is mostly kind of just spectacle and is not as exciting, I thought.
yeah. I didn't rewatch it here, but I have seen it recently enough to kind of remember it, and
Mm-hmm.
what it feels like is watching like I think you called it a couple rounds of Pac-Man, but it's almost
Mm-hmm.
like watching Call of Duty Zombies, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just, you just things just get progressively harder. You're never going, you can't win. You just get as far as you can. And like that's fine, but just watching it, like especially when that's still like a rough idea. Like
Mm-hmm.
obviously like that idea has been refined. But this is sort of like the first real go at that.
Yeah.
um, it just feels a little clunky, and it just doesn't have as much. It's the whole point is like, how do we keep making it more and more and more?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I remember, at least. Like,
Yeah.
how does it just like keep getting harder and harder, and you start to lose some of the humor and the quippy parts that were actually
Right.
what make Army of Darkness different than the other ones. Not that he doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
quips in these, but like that's kind of becomes more of the thing. Like
Right. And like,
nicknaming a shotgun the boomstick,
yeah.
because like they're just, I mean, it's stupid, but it's funny,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of the a lot of interesting spectacle. What with all of the skeletons and the different ways that Raimi's going back to old stop motion stuff, doing a lot of puppetry, puppeteering and stuff like that. There's a lot of inventive effects to make all of that play that works pretty well, except just in that it kind of feels like that's where the story's attention is at that point instead of telling the story anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which, like it's like the movie's still great. It's just that I think like the parts that everyone remembers as being great are mostly in that first half. You
Right.
know, up until the part where he finally gets the book and he realizes he suddenly doesn't remember how to say the words properly and has to Kalatu Barada. All right, there I said it. You're taking the book now. Yeah. So, but in any case, let's go ahead and move on because we got
Yep.
more movies to cover. So, taking place actually in between Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness was Darkman, which is a movie I'd heard about but never seen. Have you seen Darkman?
Oh yeah. I
Okay.
I love Darkman. I feel like, and it's weird to go back and read. Like I read the Wikipedia just when we were reading about it. I didn't rewatch it,
Mm-hmm.
but apparently it did did well in the box
Yeah.
office comparatively, and was well critically reviewed, because I always felt like this was like a movie that I liked, that I thought was underrated.
Mm-hmm.
But I
I
guess
think it is still kind of under remembered today
it's definitely
because
under
like
remembered.
I had never made a point to go see it until this time, and you're right, it rules. That movie's great. The basic premise is that Liam Neeson, before he was Oscar Schindler, was like Preston Westlake or something, some bizarre comic booky sort of name, where like he is a scientist who's trying to invent these synthetic skin masks. And then when he's attacked by mobsters and left for dead, he decides to use his ability. He is horribly disfigured in his real face, but he starts using these masks to pose as other people in order to get revenge, and he becomes Darkman. And it's a very superhero-y, comic booky sort of movie that is coming out 1 year after Tim Burton's Batman, but is frankly way more visually inventive than the '89 Batman is.
Yeah, it's almost like Sam Raimi was like, what if Phantom of the Opera guy was like a scientist superhero, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like it has sort of that flavor to it, right? As opposed to like melancholy, whatever,
Yeah.
like let's make him a badass.
Right. So, in any case, that's not one of the movies we're necessarily going to discuss in depth here, but I guess I just wanted to put it out there is that
Go
Darkman
watch.
rules, and if you haven't watched it, watch Darkman. It's actually really good. Anyway.
Yes, and it makes it just all. The last thing I'll say on this is, you understand why it's not a surprising turn for like Liam Neeson to like turn all of a sudden become like this action superstar. Like
Mm-hmm.
this was his first action movie, but you can see the groundwork there,
Yeah,
right?
well, the thing is that like what I think kind of got overlooked with him for a while before he started doing action movies again. He's a big guy, and he can be intimidating as hell on screen if that's what he's going for.
Yep. So
Yeah. All right. So, Army of Darkness was next, but then in 1995 we have The Quick and the Dead, which I think had the unfortunate timing to come out just past the peak of that early 90s Western renaissance. It was just when people were kind of starting to get tired of Westerns again. I feel like this is another one that I know you and I have liked this movie for a long time. I think we might as well have seen it together for all I know. Maybe it's about the right time period where that might happen.
Yeah.
But this movie is uh, like it's not Unforgiven, right? Like it's not trying to tell any kind of a serious story. It's trying to tell a video game story about a town that has nothing but gunfights in it, and it has lots of interesting characters and a crazy stacked cast. Sharon Stone, Gene Hackman, Leonardo DiCaprio, Russell Crowe. Russell Crowe doing like I think it might have was his first American movie. Like he'd only been in like one or two other things before that. Just before he gets big, just before Leonardo DiCaprio had only done indie stuff yet, so he hadn't done like technically. I think this came out. When did Titanic come out? Because I was thinking
Titanic would have been
like
just after
96.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously, he had attention on him. From like What's Eating Gilbert Grape, Basketball Diaries. People were starting to know who he was, but he wasn't a megastar like he became with Titanic, right?
Right.
But then apparently,
Yeah,
Sharon
like literally,
Stone.
this was his first movie after Gilbert Grape, and the Basketball Diaries was right before this. I'm looking at his filmography,
Mhm,
and then Romeo and Juliet was next, and then Titanic, and then
mhm.
we're off and running.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this movie has an incredible cast, and they're all great. And it's a very silly Western movie about all sorts of Western tropes, but it's just really fun and inventive, and it's great. It's high octane entertainment.
Yes,
Totally
it
holds up.
totally holds up. It
Gary
was,
Sinise also in it.
yeah, it's like all these people, and it literally, there is a through story, but it's really just about gunfights, like
Yeah, the story is an excuse to have a bunch of cool gunfights, and it works.
gunfights in like a Mortal Kombat Street Fighter style, where it's
Yeah.
just like you draw who you're gonna fight and then you go fight them,
Yeah, well,
right?
and there's a lot of visual stuff that it's doing that, like, in some respects makes no logical sense and yet works well enough that the fact that no other Western looked like that, like the whole gag with, someone, are they shot? We don't know. It looks down at the shadow and you see there's a hole in in their shadow, like where the light's shining through, and like, probably not. That doesn't happen really, not really so much, but it's still funny as hell. And it's just it's a very silly, exciting Western with a great cast, and what's not to like?
Yeah,
Um,
and just real quick, also underrated title,
oh yeah.
because the Quick and the Dead is like it's I don't remember exactly what it means, but it comes from Judgment Day in the Bible, and but it so it's like taking that Judgment Day thing, but it's actually about being quick or dead, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's about gun, So the cleverness of that phrase, like I just I felt like that part is pretty cool too.
Yeah, yeah. So, so this movie, we could talk more and more about it, but we got a lot more stuff to get to, so
Let's
we'll
move.
we'll move on.
Yeah.
But the other thing to just kind of be aware of when we're talking about Sam Raimi's career is that at about this time, even when his movies start becoming farther and farther apart, a big part of that is not not because he's not working, but because he's executive producing a bajillion TV shows.
Yes.
Like Hercules: The Legendary Journey, Xena Warrior Princess, and all Briscoe County, all of those shows. Sam Raimi's like executive producer. He does a ton of stuff at that time, and also is basically becoming someone who like doesn't really have to work anymore if he doesn't want to. When you have three different shows that get syndicated at that level, yeah, you're probably doing okay. You know, like we don't have to worry too much if he gets a flop on the next film. Like that sort of thing.
Right.
But he doesn't get a flop necessarily. But his next movie is the next one we're going to discuss in detail, which is A Simple Plan, and it's not a flop, but it does actually kind of underperform. It was kind of critically acclaimed, but it didn't really make very much money.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to kind of introduce Simple Plan?
Yeah. Simple Plan. It's kind of noir type film. Um, it stars Bill Paxton, Billy Bob Thornton, and Bridget Fonda.
Mm-hmm.
Set in
We've got Brent Briscoe
Minnesota.
as the other
Oh,
friend, but
yep. Sorry,
less
yeah.
well known.
Brent
Yeah.
Briscoe is
Mm-hmm.
Lou. Yep. And believe it's somewhere in the Midwest, Minnesota, I
Yeah.
believe. And what's happening is I don't remember exactly how it starts.
They
How
are
did it kick off? Oh, they're
they're chasing a fox and find
chasing
a
the
crashed
fox.
plane.
Yep, yep. And they come across the crash plane. They go and look inside the plane. They discover the dead pilot and $4+ million. And really, the discussion then is, what do we do with the $4 million? There's a number of opinions.
Mm-hmm.
The ultimate decision is that what we'll do is we're going to wait and see what happens, and we're not going to use the money. We're going to sit on it and see kind of what transpires with, people finding the plane, the spring, the snow melt, all of that
Mm-hmm.
type of stuff. But obviously that's the simple plan, which is the joke of the movie, is that, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's very simple, except that all of them know there's more than $4 million just sitting in the where he's got it, right? And so
Right.
it's the various, like, oh well, I need some of it for this, or I've now shared it with somebody else who's given me advice about what I should do and how I should change the plan, and I should take my third. And so more and more people are finding out about it, more and more
Mm-hmm.
people are trying to use it, and it leads to just obviously grim, uh, you know ultimately they end up either killing each other, getting
Mm-hmm.
in, there's just, that's what I guess we can kind of, I'm not going to go through the
Oh, sure,
exact
sure,
plot
yeah.
points, but yeah, it's sort
Well,
of, it all turns
well,
very, very dark.
it's funny that we were just talking about the Evil Dead and the whole idea that sort of Ash was sort of doomed as soon as he was present for this playing of the audio tape, which it's like it's interesting how sometimes the morality of these Raimi movies is sort of very like fatalistic in that way. It's like, does it mean that Ash deserves all of that? Of course not, but it doesn't matter. The universe doesn't care that he didn't ask for any of that. It's just, nope, he's doomed forever. And I think in a lot of the same ways, this movie, it's like as soon as they find that money, they're all doomed. Like there's no right answer. Like there's no, it's the sort of thing where as much as it seems like, well, it's like Bill Paxton is the one that like immediately is saying, no, this seems like real bad news, right? We shouldn't do this. We should call the police. We should say what we found. But at the same time, he's there with his brother, who is, it's never made really clear if he's like specifically like developmentally disabled or if he's just a little bit like not the smartest guy in the room. He's not really ever been able to make much of his life, but and then his brother Jacob's buddy are the three guys that find it. And they're Lou in particular has gambling debts and is like, what are you talking about? We're going to walk away from $4.3 million. But Bill Paxton is reasonably saying, someone's going to come looking for $4.3 million. Right? Like, you can't just take that. People are gonna find out. So they eventually persuade him, it's like, well, but what if? What would it take for you to be okay with this? And, even then, it's interesting because Bill Paxton's character is framed from the beginning as like the smart one, the reasonable one, the one who's not a screw up, the one who, if anyone could do this, maybe it's him. But then over the course of the movie, we kind of understand that he's kind of also sort of an extremely tightly wound individual who maybe has his own sort of blind spots, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's I want to like shout out in particular Billy Bob Thornton as Jacob, the brother in this movie, is amazing. I think it may be my favorite Billy Bob Thornton performance ever. It's just an incredible character and an incredible performance.
It is because it your point about like Hank is it's incredibly important of how the movie unfolds because he is presented to us as the kind of he's the reasonable one,
Hmm.
right? And yes, the situation is keeps progressing, but he keeps moving through this, and he's not really making the best decisions right all the time, and he ends up creating some of these scenarios because of what he's doing,
Hmm.
even though he's the smart reasonable one. And what happens is as we get near the end, and again, no spoilers obviously, like we're talking about a movie that we both watched, but Billy Bob Thornton in his final scene where he basically Billy Bob Thornton's character convinces Hank that he needs to kill him
Hmm.
because he doesn't want to live anymore with all of what's happened. Like
Hmm.
he didn't need the money. He wasn't like he was content with his life, right?
Well, yeah, I
Well,
mean,
no, not content with his life, but you know what I mean? He had a life that he had kind of learned to live. And then
hmm.
when this got introduced, it complicated it. And because either again, he wasn't the smartest guy or he had a
Hmm.
disability, this was too much. And then they ended up doing all these things. They ended up killing his friend and taking things. He was now losing things instead of gaining things.
Hmm.
Like he didn't want to live anymore. And so the only reasonable way out of it, which the character who's presented as not having the smartest ideas is the one that comes up with the only idea that's left at that point, right? Which is, well, either I kill myself and then everybody figures out what's happened, or you can do it and frame it and then you can get away with this,
Hmm.
right? And so he ends up having to kill his own brother because of the path that they led him down. Like it's a
Yeah.
very dark, right? But it only works because of how convincing Billy Bob Thornton is, right?
Yeah, like he's what's really one of the interesting ways that the dynamic changes over the course of the film, how we see these characters is like just like we said, Hank, Bill Paxton's character is framed as like the smart one, the reasonable one, and it is true that he's simultaneously more educated and probably from an IQ standpoint the smartest of any of the characters in the movie,
Right.
but has his own serious emotional blind spots in the way he understands people, the way he treats his own family, and the way he treats his own life, and the way he thinks of himself. Whereas what we start to see is that while Billy Bob Thornton is kind of a screw up, he's never amounted to much, he has this sort of dream of owning the family farm, but that has is always been realistic, and you get the feeling that he does kind of know that, but he doesn't have anything else. Um, but at the same time, we start to realize how much more insightful he is about human behavior and how much more of a kind heart he has compared to Bill Paxton. So, like, even though, like, the first escalation of the situation is when Jacob panics and hits the neighbor on the snowmobile with the tire iron, right, the crowbar. And that's kind of the first escalation, is because he kind of panics in that regard, right? But
Right.
at the same time, why were they in that situation? Because Bill Paxton, who had made the others promise not to tell anybody, then tells his wife anyway. And his wife starts overthinking everything and starts saying, well, you need to take some of the money and go put it back in the plane so that when people find the plane, there will be some money there and they'll think that nobody's found it yet. And that's the only reason that they're going back out there.
Yep.
And so he panics in the moment, which is obviously not great, but at the same time, it is a moment of panic that he is immediately feeling like, wait, no, sorry, I got to turn myself in for this. I can't live with this. But unfortunately, by that point, Hank has, in cold blood, that discovered, oh, wait, this guy's not actually dead. But if I don't finish him, everything blows up. and so smothers him. Like, and so, it's one of those where Jacob is really kind of the one with the heart and the one with like, this. There's a question early on between Bill Paxton and Bridget Fonda about like the morality of it. Like before he shows her the money, he asks her hypothetically, like, what would you do if you found a bunch of money? And she's very clear to like, oh well, no, you wouldn't keep it. It would be stealing. Um, but then, of course, presented with the actual money, starts immediately thinking about how to get away with it, right? Whereas Jacob is the one that, perhaps just by virtue of not necessarily understanding all the complexities of the situation, doesn't see any problem with keeping found money, but nonetheless is the one that has kind of more of a developed sense of morality. And like, there's that amazing scene midway through where they're kind of just talking through, the mess they're in, and he kind of idly talks to through, about the farm, and like, if Dad had had this kind of money, he never would have done that to himself, implying he killed himself. And
Right.
Hank is like, "What are you talking about? He got in a car accident." And Jacob's like, "Hank, he got in a car accident on the road he drove on 4 times every day for his whole life. Like, what are you?" But we just sort of, we realize like Jacob is the one that like watches people, observes them, and
Right.
understands what's going on in a way that Hank doesn't, because Hank is too wrapped up in himself.
Yep.
And it's just fascinating, but horrific as we watch these people end up like, it's a classic setup, right? Like, I mean, think about Treasure of the Sierra Madre, right? Like the idea of a group of people presented with a ton of money. What do you do about it? You start becoming untrustworthy. You don't trust everyone else. What are you going to do? And it's a classic setup. Like,
Yeah.
but it's these characters are just so well drawn and well performed, and just the intricacies of this particular story and what's going to happen and the tension, it's all just incredible. But one of the things that I think is interesting to talk about from the Sam Raimi-ness of it all is, compared to every other one of his movies before this, it's very restrained from a directorial standpoint. Like one of the Sam Raimi calling cards in all of his other movies is the camera is constantly moving all over the place with all these really inventive shots and weird angles, and cameras swooping through, chasing Ash through the walls of the cabin. We didn't talk about that, but it's one of the most amazing gags ever of like,
Yeah.
we've got the camera chasing him all through the cabin, into the walls, out and around, and then it comes through a doorway and it loses him. It can't find him. It's actually like looking around like, wait, where'd he go?
Yes.
But in any case, in this movie, it's there's none of that, right? It's like, it's really just very, very traditional filmmaking in that regard.
Yeah. And you know, what I noticed watching it this time that, I hadn't ever picked up on before, but as we're actually watching more Sam Raimi movies, there is still some of his, like, I don't know how to describe it, but it's almost like they're like, sometimes when he does like scenes where he's not going crazy, because again, it's almost like that pacing thing. It's it's sitting there feeling like super, like the opposite, right? Like super simple, like uncomplicated, like a 3 camera setup TV show,
Hmm.
right? Like you're watching a sitcom from the early 90s, right? Where there's nothing complicated. And that's what, like, most of this movie is actually shot like that, where
Mm-hmm.
you watch it and you're like, man, for such a great plot, like this is some very bland
Well,
camera work.
I would say restrained more than bland, but there's overlap in the two, right? I think in some respects there's maybe some, like, it seems like he is deliberately deciding to try to figure out how to make a more mainstream movie,
Yes.
right? Um, and to some extent, like some of the stories from The Quick and the Dead are things like Gene Hackman really being frustrated with having to put up with all the strange camera setups, and is like, why do you need a shot where I, you know, tap my boot and then tip my hat and then sit back at this precise angle in exactly this rhythm? Why don't you just put the camera on me and let me play the friggin' character? And so, whereas in this one, it is really much more like it lets the performances shine in a way that that they can be a little more nuanced
Yep.
in a way that's harder when the cameras are all over the place. So I think it's interesting to look at that, and especially given his next few movies where that trend kind of continues, right? So let's
Yep.
probably go ahead and move on just to try to get through everything we're trying to talk about.
Yep. Yeah. The
Um,
only other thing, the last thing I would say about this movie though is that I think that the author and the screenwriter have a lot to do with this
mm,
as well. This book, the guy only wrote 2 books. This book and The Ruins. The Ruins is not as good a movie as this one is, but The
no,
Ruins, the book is phenomenal. It's one of my
yeah,
favorite books.
I,
Yeah.
I, I agree. In fact, I remember when you read it, you told me I should read it, and I did, and you're right, it's great.
Yeah.
And it, it's very different in the sense that it is kind of a supernatural sort of monster story, the ruins, and then the movie is kind of like it's that story, but it just loses a lot of what makes the book good.
Right,
Um,
because a lot of what makes the book good is similar to what makes this story good. Even though you've put in the supernatural element, it's all about like how the human beings under this pressure respond to it.
mhm,
Which that movie doesn't tell that story the same way that this one does. But
yeah,
anyway, so that would not
yeah.
that's my last thing on this.
So
Yeah.
so in any case, the simple plan, we can see that he is working hard to try to make more traditional mainstream Hollywood sorts of movies. It seems like that's a specific intent. And his next movie, For the Love of the Game, or actually, For Love of the Game, not For the Love, which I don't know. I feel like it feels weird to not say the love of the game. I don't know. Anyway, it's a baseball movie with Kevin Costner.
Yes.
And I had not seen it before. Have you seen it?
Yes.
It's okay. Like I think the baseball parts are more interesting than the relationship parts. Um, it's
Yeah,
the
it's trying to do it's got a angle that it's trying to do
yeah.
that is fine.
It's
It's
the structure is neat, which is we have this baseball player who's on the cusp, perhaps, of retirement. The things that he's kind of built for himself in his baseball career are starting to. He's seeing the finish line coming up. And he's also just ended a relationship that he's feeling conflicted about. And so he's pitching a game and thinking back over the course of his life and the story of that relationship. And we're cutting back and forth between the flashbacks of that relationship and the game. And over the course of this game, we start realizing, wait, he's on track to pitching a perfect game, which is a big deal in baseball. Meaning, if anyone doesn't know that term, like if you don't follow baseball, it's basically it doesn't have to be all strikeouts, but it means no one on base, no one gets on
no
base,
one
right?
ever gets the base. Yeah.
Right. So even if the batter hits the ball and it's not a foul ball, if they are tagged out before they get to first base, it still counts.
Yep.
But since a lot of pitchers don't necessarily pitch a whole game anyway, right? Like you have a second pitcher come in for the last couple of innings or something like that. For one pitcher to stay on there the whole time and pitch the perfect game, that's a big deal. And so he is on track to doing that, which just makes each successive pitch feel all the more intense. Because wouldn't it be great to pitch a perfect game on your way out, but you don't want to start psyching yourself out about it? And this is all at the same time that he's flashing back on how did his relationship go wrong? How
Yeah.
did he psych himself out of his relationship? And like it's a neat structure, but at the same time, I don't know. I just like every time that we're just watching the relationship backstory stuff, it's less interesting than the baseball stuff. It doesn't carry its own weight for me in the movie.
No, I agree. Didn't rewatch it. Have seen it a
Mm-hmm.
number of times. It's to your point. The concept that they were going for is better than the execution.
Yeah.
Like it's a fun concept that like you would relate the baseball pitching the perfect game and how and the stress that comes as you get further along with like how your life goes and all that. Like that's all like a really cool idea.
Hmm.
It just doesn't quite land it.
Yeah. Also, I have to say that I have liked Kevin Costner in things. I'm not sure he's doing his best work in this movie. I don't know. Part of it was a little distracting to me is that they're making a big deal about how his character is 40, which is old for a baseball player, except that Kevin Costner in there is 46 and he's looking 54. Like I'm just looking at him and I'm saying, is he 40? No, I'm not sure he's 40. He looks older than 40 to me. I guess he
Yeah.
wasn't that much older than 40, but even still. Anyway, the but yeah, so let's it's fine. It's not bad. It's got some good parts. It's not great. But it's very un-Sam Raimi, as we have come to understand what Sam Raimi's traits are. Like you can't see any Sam Raimi in there hardly at all. There's just like little fleeting moments that seem like something he'd do, but that's it. Um, but then we've got The Gift, which is a little bit more got more of his stuff, but is also still very much in this vein of like trying to make like a normal movie, even
Right.
if it's got supernatural stuff. So this is the Kate Blanchett is a psychic in the South movie. It's got Giovanni Ribisi in it. It's got Hilary Swank in it. It's got Keanu Reeves playing a bad guy. It's I remembered it being better than it was when I rewatched it this time. In fact, further than that, I feel like I remembered it being thought of as really, really pretty good. And then as I was like kind of looking up, it's like, oh no, not only did it really not make very much money, but it was also not well reviewed at the time. And I'm like, oh gosh, that's not even how I remembered it. But I don't know. What do you think about The Gift?
I haven't seen it in a long time. I was
Mm,
probably more where you. I think I remembered it probably more positively than it was
mm-hmm.
truly received, and mostly because I mean it had a cool like bayou moodiness to
Mm-hmm.
it,
Yeah.
that I
I
think.
it's nice visually. It's got some good stuff going on there. Um, it's like the story is a little interestingly enough. After Simple Plan, the screenplay of The Gift is by Billy Bob Thornton, and literally the character played by Kate Blanchett is based on his mother, who also did psychic readings in the South. Now the murder story part is not part of like that wasn't real, but the character was based on his mom. But yeah, like it's okay, but like I'm not sure that like I love Keanu Reeves. I think he's done some great stuff. I think he's not at his best here. Hilary Swank was fresh off of Boys Don't Cry, and she's playing a cliche. And Giovanna Ribisi was told to turn everything up to 14, and then they left it in the movie that way. It's like, it's like there's some okay stuff. Kate Blanchett's good. You know, I thought it was okay. Greg Kinnear is supposed to be actually threatening by the end, which just does not play at all. Um, it's spoilers, but for a movie came out in the year 2000. Let's move on to because we're moving on to 2002 with Spider-Man, where everything changes for Sam Raimi again. He reinvents Hollywood blockbusters. Um, I mean, because there had been superhero movies before, obviously. We had the Superman movies, we
Yep.
had the Batman movies, but then those were both kind of peaks where you had some really big hits that kind of petered out because you had people trying to follow off on that success and nothing really kind of quite working, right? So you had Batman and you had a few sequels, but then that all kind of, drags out as well. But then Spider-Man, 1, 2, and 3 is 2002 through 2007, at which point, you are not quite in the MCU yet, but at the same time, things are like never quite cool all the way off again after that, right? For as far as like superhero movies and the mold of them. And part of that, of course, I think is that, the CGI is starting to finally really be good enough to really more believably depict superheroic action on screen.
Yep.
But Spider-Man, especially after the last couple of runs of movies, is very, very Raimi. Both with a lot of just visual stuff and also just a lot of the ways it depicts everything. Tobey Maguire has a lot of great eye reaction shots and the body horror decision to have his webs come out of organic little spider shooters on his wrists instead of being mechanical devices that he made. Was kind of controversial, I recall, at the time, because it's certainly not how it works in the comic books, and also it doesn't really make biological sense. Like spiders don't have the webs come out of their feet, right?
Right.
Like, but but at the same time, it's just
That would have been quite a movie if the web came out of his
well.
butt like a spider does.
Yeah, well, like even as it is, when he shoots it for the first time, it is very much doing a teenage, ejaculation joke, right? I mean, that's what's happening. It's played like, oh my gosh, what's happening? This is embarrassing. I'm in school. That's how it plays out. But like, so there's some great stuff in it. I love Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker. I think the one, like, we're going to talk about Spider-Man 2 in more detail here, so I won't spend too much on the first one. In fact, let's just go ahead and jump. Like, the first one has, Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin. We have Kirsten Dunst as MJ, James Franco as Harry Osborn, and everyone obviously except, well, I guess Willem Dafoe does show up in Spider-Man 2, doesn't he? So
Yeah.
let's just move on to Spider-Man 2. Why? Well, I said a bunch about it already, so why don't you talk a little bit about Spider-Man 2?
I mean,
I'm just trying to not do all the talking.
no, I know. It's just Spider-Man 2, like, but this is more this place actually is like more your wheelhouse. But
I suppose.
you've said a lot of the right things, like, which this just absolutely, like, Spider-Man 1 was like, oh, hey, superhero movies are fun and new again. And Spider-Man 2 was like, yeah, this is a thing. Like, we can go big here, right? Because the CGI that, runs the Doc Ock stuff, right? Like, I mean,
Believe it or not, a lot of the arms is actually puppetry. Like, now the big action sequences where, the full shots where they're riding on the train and stuff like that, that's CGI. But a lot of the shots where it's just him, like, talking to him and stuff, that's all done with physical puppeted arms.
that's actually pretty cool. I was thinking more of like the more epic scenes with, like,
Yeah.
the trains and the bridges and all that kind of stuff.
Oh
and
yeah, for sure.
the
Climbing
smashing
up the
things.
buildings and
Yeah, and all of that type of stuff. And it's like now, and the response that people had to loving that just fast paced, shiny CGI, like, it doesn't matter, and yeah, you want a good story, but you can get away with just actually being just really, really cool.
Well,
Right. And
yeah.
then this movie has a good story. So I'm not saying that, but it's like the coolness made it kind of transcend people who wanted to go watch movies, people who watch movies and didn't care about story. Now all of a sudden, like, this was a thing that they could lean into because it was just big and cool and fast. And that just kickstarted. And then what happens is then you come in with, like, Batman Begins, like 3 or 4 years later, and you put this sort of like new moody spin onto another superhero character, and it's like you started to remix the whole universe.
Batman Begins was in 2005, so it was in between 2 and 3 of this series.
Right. So but it's all like coming together at the same time. Like, you've got yes, there's CGI in Batman Begins, but now that's much more of that's a superhero, but kind of retelling of a story in a completely character driven way. Right. And then you've got these big, flashy, cool Spider-Mans that are coming out. And again, they're done. They're good stories and they're good characters, but they're much, much shinier than they are like anything else. Yeah.
One of the big things that the Spider-Man movies do is, like, X-Men, the Bryan Singer one, predates the first Spider-Man movie, I think. I'm pretty sure that's true. But while that movie is pretty good, considering all the context around it, and trying to ignore that, the Bryan Singer of it now, but one of the things that was really notable about it was the decision to put all the characters in black leather instead of their comic book costumes because the logic was that would look silly on screen. But for Spider-Man to be willing, like, no, let's put him in the comic book costume. Let's not try to reinvent it and make it look cool for the early 2000s. Let's just make it. Like, we can try to do what we can to make that design look as good as it can, but let's not try to reinvent the iconic image that is actually what we're trying to. It almost feels like the first comic book superhero movie that actually thinks it's cool that it's coming from a comic book instead of trying to distance itself from that.
In the modern ones, I think the
Yeah.
Supermans were pretty much.
Yeah, I suppose.
I mean,
I
he
mean,
literally wore like a spandex like Superman suit.
yeah, well, that's true. It's from the costume specifically, for sure. But yeah, but Spider-Man 2 is just where it all clicks perfectly, right? I think there's no other superhero movie I can think of that better sells how difficult it would be to have the secret identity and the double life, right? Like, what other one is better than Spider-Man 2 at selling how hard that would be? He's trying to work a job, he's trying to go to school, he's trying to have friends, he would like to have a girlfriend, and it's just none of it works because he's also trying to be Spider-Man. And as much as he loves pieces of being Spider-Man, it's ruining everything else about his life, which is so Spider-Man. That is like one of the defining character traits of Spider-Man, is he just can't catch a freaking break. Every time Spider-Man wins, Peter Parker loses somehow. It's universal in almost every Spider-Man story.
Well, yeah, and to just obviously it's at different degrees, but to our whole theme in discussing these Sam Raimi themes, this is very much like the Ash thing, right? Like,
yeah.
it's very much like,
how much can we torture Pete Parker?
Yeah, it's
Uh,
it's once this path starts, there is no great ending, right? Like, so
yeah. And it's just like, even, well, we'll talk briefly about 3, but like even in 3 where things start to go a little better for him, that's where he discovers that, like, it goes to his head and turns him into kind of a jerk, like, but
which also happened to Ash.
yeah, but it's such like, there's a running gag in Spider-Man 2 that is so just fun and emblematic, which is that when he's been hired to take pictures at the engagement party for J. Jonah Jameson's son, only to discover that Mary Jane is the fiance. And he is at this fancy party, and we've already established that he's constantly late with his rent, he can't hold a job, he's failing his classes, and everything's going badly. And now he's at this party where the love of his life is going to get engaged to somebody else. And so they keep coming by with these plates of hors d'oeuvres, and every time he reaches for one, someone else takes it right before he can get it. And it happens twice, and then the third time, when he's fed up with everything, and he more aggressively goes, and he makes sure he gets that particular glass, and, oh wait, no, it's empty already. And it's just so typical of, this movie just will not let him get a break.
Right.
And even when, like, I think that this movie's ending is incredible, and kind of, it's amazing that they went with this. Not, like, so first of all, I'll say, I wish that Mary Jane didn't have to literally leave this guy at the altar. Like, I feel like that was a beat too far, especially since they established him as a nice guy, right? He's a nice guy who didn't deserve that. And so I feel a little bit frustrated with that, especially because it's like, do we need her running through the park in the wedding dress? Like, I don't know. That feels a little over the top for me. But her coming to him and telling him, you don't decide for me that you don't want to put me in danger. Let me be the one to make that decision. I want to be with you. I want to support you. And then of course he hears the sirens and she says, "Go get him, Tiger." Right? And it's great. It's heroic. We get the happy web swinging as he goes off to save the day. But the last shot in the movie is not him happy web swinging. It's her looking conflicted out the window as she watches him, realizing how hard this is actually going to be. And it's like that's an amazing ending. You know, it's Peter gets one thing, he loses something else, always. And Mary, I think Kirsten Dunst is incredible in that movie. I think she's just fine in the first one, but in two she's really great.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, and Alfred Molina as Doc Ock. We got to touch on him, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing is if you're going to make the movie that is like bigger than life comic book, and yes, we talked about the CGI part, but you've got to have it grounded in a personality that can also play bigger than life.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
And he does the same thing that we see with the villains that come after that. It's like, okay, you can ham this up. Like, again, Sam Raimi's, he's a guy who can get a lot out of you. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Doc Ock is he's just a big personality in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to, I mean, again, going back to like, you look at the Batman thing and it's like, and then it makes it okay for Heath Ledger to play the way that he does. It makes it okay for Tom Hardy to play the way that he does.
Mm-hmm.
And then you end up with, I haven't seen all of them, but I'm familiar obviously with some of the villains that come through in this Marvel Cinematic Universe. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like, you got to have some larger than life, like, energy. And he just leans into it in this movie.
I think Alfred Molina as Doc Ock has not been topped in terms of supervillains on screen, in my opinion. Like, because he sells the whole arc, right? He sells the idea of brilliant, idealistic scientist whose reach perhaps just barely exceeds his actual grasp, right?
Right.
He's got some arrogance, he's got some hubris there. Um, and the irony of it exceeding his grasp, even when he has built robotic tentacle arms that he controls with his brain. He's like, "Oh, but don't worry, there's a little chip right here," which is just an amazing little bit of shorthand storytelling, right? To establish, journalist was like, "Wait, it's controlled by your brain. Don't you worry that it could go the other way?" And he's like, "Nope, see, because of this little chip that's going to conveniently get fried out when I'm, electrocuted later." And then that's, sells part of the transformation, but also just this idea that he wants to do good, but he wants to do good. He wants it to be him to do good.
Yep.
And then when he gets interfered with, when he's feeling like, "Wait, no, I can do it. I can do it. I can get it back under control," and Spider-Man stops him, and then his wife gets killed in the explosion. Like, all of that, you can understand why, like, he has nothing else. He could fixate that Spider-Man kind of ruined it for him, but what's his overwhelming obsession is, no, I could have done it. It was working. If I had just had more time, I could have done it. And so now I have to do that. And so that's his drive immediately, right? And he only fixates on Spider-Man later, incidentally, right? It's because, A, he's trying to rob the bank. Spider-Man tries to stop him. I also heard someone say once that Spider-Man shouldn't have tried to stop him because it's like, it's in the same vein of, like, you know, uh, the bank's insured. You shouldn't, like, get people hurt in the collateral damage. But, like, that, you watch the scene and it doesn't play out that way. He is already hurling the bank vault doors around and stuff like that. Like, it's before Spider-Man intervenes, people are already in danger.
Correct.
But in any case, Spider-Man tries to stop him there. And then it's later, he doesn't care about Spider-Man. He's got the money, he's building his lab, but he needs the precious tritium. Who has it? Harry Osborn. Harry Osborn believes Spider-Man killed his dad, so he says, "Oh, you get Spider-Man for me." And so again, like, that's where it all ties together. And also just, the whole dynamic of Peter can't win, of his best friend wants to kill Spider-Man because he thinks Spider-Man killed his dad, and he only thinks that because Peter has decided to honor the last request of the insane supervillain who tried to kill him. Don't tell Harry. Okay, so now I will let my best friend hate the person he doesn't realize is me for not believing, like that whole thing. Poor Peter, right? Just can't, nothing,
Just
can't win.
like you said, you can't win.
Yeah. So in any case, I know that we're running up on time here, so maybe we go ahead and.
Sorry, my dog's having a dream where his tail is doing a helicopter. Sure, it's a
Nice.
great dream, buddy.
Yeah.
Um,
But yeah, so maybe do you have anything else you want to touch on with Spider-Man 2 before we kind of blaze through the rest of his filmography and
no, I
wrap
think
up?
we covered. I think we covered the relaunch of the superhero franchises, the phenomenal supervillain. I mean, those are my big takeaways from that movie. And and to your point of earlier of him trying to find, like, he finally found his voice, right? Like Sam Raimi, like it has the tactics and the techniques that he used when he was a B movie, like kind of indie guy, but he finally got the blockbuster, right? Like he didn't have to do it, didn't have to be one or the other, which is what we sort of see in those kind of transitional movies. And then so that I think that just should be the closing of this, is he really figured it out. And then he went and took that break, and then he went and produced
Well, but then
all those other things.
it's turned it. He has such a strange like arc of his career because of course, like here's the thing: the next thing he makes is Spider-Man 3, which I rewatched, and the thing is, it's not as bad as people kind of remember. Like, is it as good as 2? Definitely not. Does it have major problems? Yes. But it's got a lot of great stuff in it too. It is not, people remember that as being worse than it actually is. It became
It was just a hard follow-up to such a good movie, and then people wanted this to the completion of the trilogy. They thought he was just going to stack another great movie on top of a great movie, and it just didn't happen.
Well,
right?
the other thing too is that there's the shorthand version of this, which is a little bit oversimplifying, but is like some of the producers are like, hey, we gave you Spider-Man and you did it your way and it was great. Reinvented the blockbuster. Then we let you do Spider-Man 2 your way and it's even better. Incredibly acclaimed, huge, lots of money, people love it. Now for Spider-Man 3, we've got some notes. We're going to force you to include an additional villain on top of the ones that you're already interested in, and it has to be the one that you have said already in interviews that you don't like. You can see how that messes the whole thing up a little bit, but it's really not as bad as people remember. It's got some great stuff in it. But then the only 2 movies he's made, well, I guess before the most recent Doctor Strange, he made Drag Me to Hell, which we kind of touched on briefly as like that is almost him going like back to form. Like, let's make a medium budget movie that is kind of in my wheelhouse, and he did. And aside from some perhaps not ideal treatment of the idea of Romani people, like they're not explicitly Romani people in the movie, but it's not unclear what he's drawing on there. Like, that's not great, but at the same time, the movie is pretty successful in most of what it tries to do, which is basically exactly what it says on the tin. The movie's called Drag Me to Hell, and it delivers. Like, that's what it is.
That's basically what happens. Yeah.
And it's almost the opposite of what I remembered with The Gift, in the sense that I remember thinking, yeah, that movie rules, and then I rewatch it and it rules, and it didn't do very well, which sucks. It literally did not even make as much as your average sort of run-of-the-mill horror movie that year. Which I guess it's just too weird for a lot of people, I suppose.
Yeah, it's like, it's fine.
Yeah. And then I watched, like 4 years after that, he does Oz the Great and Powerful, which I had not seen until rewatching for all of this. And it's not good. I mean, it has some okay stuff in it. It's a big budget thing again, but it's just like, if I had seen it, I would honestly have been more worried about the new Doctor Strange movie, because it really feels like he's just lost in overproduced CGI backgrounds. And honestly, James Franco is bad in it. He is like he's sleepwalking through the performance. He does not sell the role at all. I mean, there's a few scenes where he's okay, but like overall, it just I don't buy him at all. He feels like, you know how sometimes I don't know how much this was the issue, but you hear talking about like part of the problem with performances in the Star Wars prequels is, have someone stand on a green screen soundstage and act against a tennis ball, right? Like people don't that's a skill set that not everybody has, and James Franco's role feels like that's what he's doing. But even in scenes where he's literally standing there, against like Mila Kunis or Vanessa Williams, like why does he not act better? And I
I don't.
think part of the reason is I think he did a ton of movies that year and he was just overcommitted and he had all sorts of stuff going on with him at that time. That is all part of a piece of why you don't see him in movies as much anymore. But in any case, it's not great. It's not terrible. It's better, I think, than the Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland movie, which it has a similar feel to in some respects, but I like more. It's not ugly in the way that one is.
Got it.
And then his most recent movie, return to feature films, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I know it's divisive for some, but I loved it. It's great. I liked it. He gets to do Raimi stuff in it in the MCU, which a lot of people worried he would lose his sort of authorial voice there, but I think he keeps it and it's great. I like it. All right. So are we right at time? Like, how are you doing? I know
Yeah,
we're on a clock.
we're pretty much right at time. I gotta
Okay.
go take care of some stuff because I gotta travel tomorrow.
Okay.
So
All right. Well, so we'll go ahead and leave it there. But Tom Cruise, is that what we decided on?
Tom Cruise
All right.
will settle on the movies via
Yeah.
text,
hmm
and
So yeah, we're going to talk about the life. Well, not the life so much, but the career, the films of Tom Cruise.
films of Tom Cruise.
We will probably touch on elements of his life which cannot be entirely avoided, but that's not the focus of our conversation.
They cannot,
Yeah.
but with Top Gun Maverick being out and it being an absolute phenomenal good
Yeah.
time,
It's
it's
in
just nice to remember that Tom Cruise, the movie star, makes some fun stuff to watch.
He sure does. Yeah, so that we'll figure out which movies we're going to pick specifically, but yeah, that'll be our next episode. So with that, we're going to leave it here, and so between now and whenever we record that, everyone watch good movies.
All right.